Hi, I'm Cam. I'm an amateur artist. I dabble in photography. I make little demon stuffed animals, and I happen to be a trans man. So this is Vocabulary with Cam. I'm going to do definitions based on my own perception and my own life. And I'm going to start with gender identity versus gender expression. So gender identity is your internal sense of self and how that gender operates in the world. You can be assigned a gender at birth, usually based on your genitalia from observation from a doctor. But you don't necessarily identify as that gender, or you can. Really, your gender identity is internal. Now, what you decide to express, think of gender as kind of it's a social construct, the way we interact with each other and understand gender from observations. You think of gender as kind of like a show. So your gender expression is how you decide to present your gender or a gender to the world. So I am currently dressed in typically like attire that's associated with men and colors that are associated with men. My haircut is very, very short. I'm wearing facial hair, which is typically associated with men. And so this is how I'm expressing my gender to you right now. But it doesn't necessarily mean that's my gender identity. And internally, I could feel like I'm a woman. Or I could feel like I'm some variation of non-binary or some variation of gender fluid. It's not necessarily apparent by my expression. So a gender identity is how you feel on the inside, and a gender expression is how you present a gender to the world. That kind of leads to the conversation about cisgender versus transgender. Cisgender, well, let me start with the prefixes. The word trans is actually stemmed from a Latin word, which I don't recall at this moment, and it means on the opposite side of. So if you think of it like a river, trans person happens to fall on the opposite side of the river than the way they were assigned at birth. So they were assigned female at birth, they identify with something that is on the opposite side of that. Could be a trans man, it could be a man, it could be gender fluid, but it's not what they were assigned at birth. When we were discussing people who weren't transgender, we used to say normal, which statistically makes sense, but in rationality, or in actuality rather, we think of normal as being something that is right. So using the term normal, people who are normal versus trans people, makes it sound like being trans is wrong. So we kind of coined the term cisgender. Cisgender is a Latin term for on the same side as. So you are on the same side as the gender you were assigned at birth. So your gender identity falls in line with your gender assigned at birth. So that is how you got cisgender. So cisgender is your gender identity is the same as what you were assigned at birth, and transgender is your gender identity is not what it was assigned at birth. So that kind of gets us into the concept of binary. We originally, and I say we as in like the scientific academic community, used to believe that gender fell in a binary. This is primarily the European culture, was that there was man and then there was woman, and those were the only two boxes. And they were very binary. If you didn't fit in the man box, you didn't fit in the wooden box, you must be an alien. Like there was no other options. There was man and there was woman. And that's where we got the binary system from. When we started to expand that concept, I want to say in the 90s, we started to expand it into the idea that it's more like a spectrum, that there was variations of being man and being woman and being something in between that we didn't really have words for at the time. When someone identifies as being non-binary, for example, in my understanding, they identify as somewhere as not being exclusively one box or the other, but falling somewhere on that spectrum. And not really necessarily having a defined space on that spectrum, but just being somewhere on that spectrum helps them understand their own gender identity. Some people, again, to my understanding, might identify as being feminine non-binary or masculine non-binary. And for me, or my understanding is that if our spectrum looks like this, and this half happens to be more masculine and this happens to be more feminine, and they identify as being non-binary, feminine, they kind of operate in this space over here. And it doesn't necessarily mean they're solely identifying as a woman, but that they're kind of operating on this feminine side or this masculine side if they identify as non-binary masculine. And then that kind of gets us into the concept of gender fluid versus agender. A person who identifies as being gender fluid feels that the gender kind of shifts over time, and sometimes the time is very short, sometimes it's different locations, and sometimes it's just different days. You never really know. Every person's experience is a little different. I have a friend who is pretty well known in the community who had a gender neutral name and who used to go to work as a man but used to go shopping as a woman, and he'd go out to play as a woman, but he'd go out to like cut the grass as a man. And they identified as being not gender fluid because their gender kind of shifted with each activity they did. Whereas I had a client whose gender identity would switch each day, and they never really knew where they fit on the spectrum every day. So some days they would feel very kind of a mishmash of both genders. Some days they would feel very masculine, some days they would feel very feminine, and they had kind of adjusted their attire to address that. And that becomes really hard when it comes to pronouns because a lot of pronouns are very gendered. So they preferred the non-binary pronouns of they, them, which made it easy because they could keep those pronouns no matter what their attire and what their gender identity was feeling at that moment. And it's my understanding that people who feel like they are agendered feel like they operate outside the gender spectrum. Like if our understanding is gender is a way we communicate our internal sense of self in a certain way in this language here, they kind of feel like they're over here. They operate totally off the spectrum over here, and that all of their experience has not been because of gender, but because of things that they've just been naturally attracted to, or whatever. So a lot of people I know who define themselves as being agendered feel like they were assigned a gender at birth, but then not only do they not feel like they're that gender, but they don't feel like they're any gender that has been discussed or on the spectrum anywhere. And to my knowledge, that's the best definition I can give for someone who's agendered as well.